This is my second video benchmarking Forza Horizon 6. This one's going to focus on an AMD versus NVIDIA head-to-head. My last video had a lot more just variety of GPUs at variety of graphic settings. And in this matchup, we're looking at the 5070 Ti represented by the Asus Prime, and we're looking at the RX 9070 XT represented by actually the ASRock Monster Hunter Wilds Edition. And we can see that both GPUs are capable of native 1440p absolute maximum settings and averaging exactly 60 FPS in the built-in benchmark, which is pretty representative of actual open world gameplay. This is the extreme settings plus the highest ray tracing settings, and this is also using DLAA and FSR4AA at the native resolution for the highest quality anti-aliasing available. Speaking of which, both do look pretty good next to each other in the side-by-sides here. I don't see any major advantages or differences either way. And what if you instead wanted to play with some upscaling to reach higher than 60 FPS? I find in racing games 60 is pretty dang good. I'll also make myself smaller and out of the way. Just taking up less of the screen. Anyway, so if you do want to use FSR4 or DLSS at the balanced setting on a 1440p output, I do think it looks pretty good. I noticed that on fine details, especially power lines that stretch across the light colored sky backgrounds, but also some of the little thin railings and antennas and things like that. Those get a little bit garbled, but overall, I still think the output looks pretty good with the balanced upscale here. Very, very usable. And this is now getting frame rates up to 96 and 102 respectively. That does give the 5070 Ti a 6% lead, which isn't nothing. It's also not incredibly noticeable, but it's interesting that it seemed to benefit more from the upscale than the AMD card did. But it's not a massive difference either way, but win there for the 5070 Ti. Now we're looking at what if we turn ray tracing off. Now I actually find this very interesting. Even though the 9070 XT and the 5070 Ti were exactly matched at 60 FPS when using the ray tracing settings, we're back to native resolution, FSR4AA, DLAA. This is the extreme preset now though without any ray tracing. And interestingly, the 5070 Ti takes the lead. So it's actually like the reverse of what we used to always see, which is, if they were tied with ray tracing off, then, NVIDIA would take the lead with ray tracing on. They were actually tied with ray tracing on, and then NVIDIA has taken the lead slightly here with ray tracing turned off. I just find that interesting compared to where we used to see with things. Certainly still in path tracing and the heaviest ray tracing workloads, 5070 Ti usually still has a bit of an advantage here, but it's just kind of interesting that things went the other way around in this game, but it's still a 5070 Ti advantage just with ray tracing off and only by a few percent. Now, when I use the balance level upscaling on the extreme no ray tracing preset, I see the 5070 Ti increase its lead. Now, we're seeing a 13% advantage here at 154 versus 136. And so this is similar to how we saw it with the ray tracing enabled. They had been tied, and then the 5070 Ti pulled a little bit ahead when we used upscaling. Here, it was already a little bit ahead without upscaling when we have ray tracing off. And then when we turn on the upscaling, it also increases that lead a little bit compared to where it was without upscaling. So that seems consistent, but it then does push the lead to 13% here. Now, I didn't bother testing out any lower graphics settings than just Extreme plus RT and Extreme without RT because the overall frame rates were very usable at all of those settings. So certainly there's a lot more performance on the table. In my last video, I showed there was a lot of scalability in this game, but it performs well at the maximum ray tracing and non-ray tracing settings, so I don't think we need to worry about that. However, now we are going to test out what if you're playing on a 4K screen, maybe you're playing this on a big 4K TV, something like that. Well, at maximum settings, 4K Extreme plus the ray tracing, and with the native 4K resolution using DLAA and FSR4 native AA for high quality anti-aliasing, well, the game looks great, but we're only running in the mid-30s for the frame rate. The 9070 XT hitting 35 FPS average, and the 5070 Ti hitting 36, which is a 3% advantage. Overall, it's a very similar performance on both. and probably not the settings that you would want to play at, considering we could just use upscaling or turn down settings a little bit. One or the other or both is likely going to be what most people do. Also mention, if you hear all sorts of weird noises in the background, my kids are just making all sorts of fun sounds as they're playing up above me. So, whatever, they're having a good time. Just how we roll on this channel sometimes. Anyway, speaking of reducing the internal rendering resolution here with upscaling, I'm now using FSR4 and DLSS at the performance preset. So this is internally rendering at 1080p, but then using these modern upscalers to try to get a 4K-like output. And honestly, they do a very respectable job at doing so. And we're getting a lot more performance now. With the upscale, again, certain things like the power lines, especially across the lighter backgrounds of the sky and things like that. Some of the fine details in the fence railing and things like that. You can tell that we're not quite at a native 4K, but they really hold together very well. Honestly, the latest versions of FSR and DLSS look really good when doing a 1080p to 4K upscale. And like I said, performance boosts quite a bit, well over 70 FPS on both. So now let's stay at 4K resolution, but what if you're not trying to use the ray tracing? So this is the extreme preset, but without the ray tracing, so the highest non-ray traced preset the game has to offer. And we are at the native 4K, again using DLAA and FSR4AA for that crisp native anti-aliasing that looks better than what you get out of TAA. With a little bit more of a performance cost. But we have plenty of performance to do it. You can see here we're hitting 79 FPS versus 82. So it is a lead for the 5070 Ti, but once again, small single-digit percentages, 4% and 3 total FPS. So not a lot in the difference. Basically, if you want to play the game at the extreme preset with no ray tracing, both of these GPUs can do it absolutely fine at native 4K resolution, no upscaling required, and you can even get away with the performance headroom for the high-quality anti-aliasing. Now, if you wanted even more performance, you can use FSR4 and DLSS performance. Again, this is on the extreme without ray tracing preset and targeting a 4K output. The performance mode upscaling is the 1080p internal rendering resolution, targeting that 4K output. And again, looks pretty good. Already kind of said my thoughts on that. And performance has increased to 109 FPS on the 9070 XT and 111 for the 5070 Ti. So a 2 FPS and about 2% performance lead for the 5070 Ti. So overall, 5070 Ti versus 9070 XT, I would say the 5070 Ti has a slight advantage here in performance, but it's mostly tied small single-digit percentage leads most of the time. Both of them do well in ray tracing. The game supports high-quality upscaling for both. So, little bit of a lead for the 5070 Ti, but they're not worlds apart. And on the current market, the 9070 XT does cost a lot less. So there is that. But I'd say a good showing if you own either of these GPUs. You're going to be happy on a 1440p or 4K display with the kind of settings that you can use. But what if we kick things down a notch and look at one more head-to-head? This is the 9060 XT against the 5060 Ti. I'm using the 16GB version for both. If you check out the hardware unboxed VRAM testing for this game, you can see 8GB cards do have some trouble here. Now, my 5060 Ti is represented by the, I always want to say PNY, but it's PNY. Anyway, the PNY, does it even have a model name? I don't even know. PNY OC 16GB GDDR7 doesn't seem to have a model name as far as I can tell. And then for the 9060 XT 16GB, we have the Asus Prime model. Now, you can see here that at 1440p max settings extreme plus ray tracing at native 1440p, it's not an amazing experience. 39 FPS on the night. Oh no, guys. That's a typo. That's 9060 XT, and that's the 5060 Ti. I'm just gonna like leave my head here, and we're just not gonna worry about that, okay? So it's the AMD one on top, the NVIDIA one on the bottom. I apologize for the typo. I'm not re-recording this whole video, because speaking of my kids, I'm gonna need to go get them dinner in just a second here. All right, so anyway, the point was native max settings with the maxed out ray tracing was playable, but probably not the frame rates you're looking for. So now we're looking at kicking on a balanced level upscaling. This is extreme plus ray tracing, but DLSS and FSR4 balanced 1440p output. And now we're over 60 FPS on both GPUs. We've now switched to a 5060 Ti lead by 3% and 2 frames per second. So similar to what we saw with the 9070 XT versus 5070 Ti matchup, it seems like the NVIDIA GPU gets a little bit more of a performance boost out of the upscale than what the AMD GPU is getting. But the overall performance is still small single-digit performance differences, so really you'd have about the same experience on both, and I thought the upscale looked good on both. So now we're looking at what if you're playing at 1440p native resolution but don't want to use the ray tracing. If you turn off ray tracing and just use the extreme preset without ray tracing, both GPUs are doing over 70 FPS, but interestingly, once again, the NVIDIA GPU has a slightly bigger lead when we turn off ray tracing. So like, again, kind of the opposite of what you usually expect when looking at AMD versus NVIDIA. Just kind of strange. But anyway, it's 71 FPS versus 76. And it's the 5060 Ti that has the lead by 7% and 5 frames per second. Now, both of them are getting a very good experience here, so I think you'd be happy with either one. They have the headroom for the nice high-quality anti-aliasing with FSR4, AA, and DLAA, so pretty good experience on both of those. Now, what if you wanted even more performance and stayed at the extreme preset? Well, you could kick on balanced level upscaling, which is what we're looking at next. So this is FSR4 and DLSS balanced upscale, targeting the 1440p output, and it is with the extreme non-ray traced preset. And similar to what we saw with the 5070 Ti and the 9070 XT, we're once again seeing the NVIDIA GPU benefit a little bit more from the upscaling from a performance standpoint than the AMD one did. And since the NVIDIA GPU already had a 7% lead, it's now grown to a 12% lead due to that additional difference when they're upscaling. So 12% advantage here. So it's noticeable, but both GPUs are having a very good experience at 92 versus 103 FPS. So I think you're going to be happy on both, but definitely a win for the 5060 Ti here. Now let's drop down to 1080p resolution. Now, if you're on a 1080p display, actually pretty good experience at the absolute maximum settings, extreme plus the ray tracing, including the high quality anti-aliasing from FSR4 AA and DLAA at a full native 1080p output. And no, we're not locked to 60 FPS, but on a variable refresh rate display, there's not a huge difference between the mid-50s and locking to 60. So we're hitting 56 FPS on the 9060 XT here, and we're hitting 54 FPS on the 5060 Ti. That gives a 2 FPS and roughly 4% advantage for the AMD GPU. Again, interestingly, with the max ray tracing, I'm getting a slight performance advantage for the AMD GPU. And we'll have to look at how things go when we scale and when we turn off RT, but we'll want to see if those same interesting and uncommon performance profile kind of happens here. Now, sure enough, when we kick on quality level upscaling, I don't like to use more aggressive than quality when I'm on a 1080p output. So FSR4, DLSS quality, going for a 1080p output, so it's a 720p internal rendering resolution, but does look a lot like a native 1080p output with these more advanced versions of FSR and DLSS that we've gotten lately. And again, extreme settings plus the ray tracing. Now the 5070 Ti pulls ahead by 4% and 3 frames per second. Also, frame rates are noticeably faster than they were at native at 75 and 78, respectively. So once again, we're seeing that the Upscale boosts the performance for the 5060 Ti a little bit more than it does for the 9060 XT, but it swung from a 4% advantage for AMD at the native resolution to a 4% advantage for NVIDIA when using the upscale. So either way, it's small single-digit percentage difference, pretty similar experience on both GPUs. What if we turn the ray tracing off? Now, once again, it seems kind of strange, not what you generally expect, but I am seeing it yet again. Turn ray tracing off, and we switch from having an AMD lead at native resolution to having an NVIDIA lead at native resolution, this time by 9%. It's 101 frames per second for the 5060 Ti, up against 93 frames per second on the 9060 XT, 9% advantage for NVIDIA when we turn off the ray tracing, even though AMD had the 4% advantage when we had the ray tracing turned on. Seems backwards, but I'm kind of sounding like a broken record saying that over and over and over again. It just does seem unusual that does seem to be the case in this game, at least right now as of the time of filming. Now, overall performance here is great. I don't think you need to upscale or anything like that or turn down the graphic settings at 1080p. So there's that. What are my overall thoughts? I think that the differences between the AMD and NVIDIA GPUs that are generally pretty evenly matched, they were pretty evenly matched. The differences between them were small, but in all cases tested, it was interesting to see that AMD had the advantage in ray tracing and NVIDIA had the advantage with RT turned off. A little bit weird. We also saw on both head-to-heads that the NVIDIA GPU benefits a little bit more from upscaling from a performance standpoint than the AMD one did, but overall, none of the frame rate differences were massive, so you do get a good and fairly equivalent experience on all of them, and this game performs well on this class of hardware, both classes tested. Overall, I find this game to be very scalable, because again, here you are seeing the maximum RT settings and then the maximum non-RT settings, and there's a lot more scalability on the table if you turn down the settings from here, if you're chasing super high frame rates and stuff. So this game is very scalable. I think it is pretty well optimized. And let me know what you guys are thinking in the comment section. I hope all of you have an excellent day.